Hello everyone, my name is Josh Hurley. I'm a .NET Developer Advocate here at Amazon Web Services. Today I'm going to be talking about building modern applications with .NET on AWS. And we'll take a quick look here at the agenda. We're going to start with an overview of .NET on AWS. Then we'll look at hosting options, migrating workloads to AWS, some of our new services and features that are related to .NET 5, AWS Tools for .NET developers, some of our APN partners, and we'll look at a few Visual Studio demos, and then we'll wrap up. One message I want to make sure everyone is clear on: AWS loves .NET. And if I do nothing else, I'm hoping by the end of this talk you'll recognize that. And if I don't, please in the chat ask me questions about what you have about .NET, and if you have suggestions to improve, we're definitely open to listen. One other thing to keep in mind is this is a fairly broad topic, and we're not going to go technically deep in any one subject, so it's a level 200. We do have other videos that go deeper into topics. All right, let's take a quick look here at an overview of our .NET offerings. And as you can see here, we've been working with .NET since 2008 with the release of the .NET SDK down here in the lower left-hand corner. And as you can tell, through the last 12 years or so, we've actually continued to increase the number of offerings that are related to .NET. We have Windows Server and EC2 listed here because before 2016, .NET Framework required to be on Windows, so Windows Server and .NET were closely related. I also have listed here SQL Server, .NET, and app modernization efforts here. The recent changes I've added here include our Graviton 2 processor, our porting assistant for .NET, App2Container, and today's topic, .NET 5 support. Now, if you're like me, even though we're thinking of programming, you probably want to know what instance your application is going to live on. And we have a number of choices depending on what you're using. If you are targeting a .NET Framework application, the first 5 options here are available. Amazon EC2, which is our virtual machine service. AWS Elastic Beanstalk, which is our free service to manage deployments for EC2 and allows for scaling. Amazon Lightsail. Now, you probably, even if you're familiar with AWS, you might not have heard of this if you're an enterprise customer. Lightsail is more targeted on AWS. So if you have a web server that you want and you're under a certain budget and you don't need a number of additional features and controls that would typically come with EC2, you would use Lightsail. I put it on here just for completeness. Amazon Elastic Container Service. If you have a Docker service, you would use this to deploy that and manage that. If you use Kubernetes, you'd use Amazon Elastic Container Service for Kubernetes. Now, the last 2 services, if you're using .NET Core or .NET 5, you have the choice of these 5, but then additionally you can use AWS Fargate to orchestrate those containers, and AWS Lambda, which is our serverless function technology. Again, I put the little penguin up here just to emphasize that this is a Linux solution, or these 2 are Linux solutions, so you do need to use .NET Core, .NET 5 to target that. After you think about where they're going to live, the next thing is, well, I've got an existing app. How do I get it to AWS? Because frankly, those choices are fairly broad and sometimes overwhelming. So what I would normally do is walk customers through a decision tree here. I start up here and ask the question, do you target a virtual machine or container today? If the answer is a virtual machine, the next question will be, would you like AWS to manage the deployment of those and the scaling of those virtual machines? Or do you want to self-manage? Self-manage, you basically spin up and control those EC2 instances for virtual machine. Otherwise, you would choose Elastic Beanstalk. Again, Elastic Beanstalk is a free service What it spins up, though, you pay for just as you would if you spun up the services yourself. Now, going back up to the decision tree, if we actually chose container instead of virtual machine, instead of being a rehost discussion, it turns into more of a replatform discussion. And at this point, the question is it a .NET framework, .NET Core, .NET 5 application? The .NET framework, then the next question is, are you orchestrating with Kubernetes, or do you want to orchestrate with Kubernetes? If you do, then my recommendation would be Amazon EKS hosted managed Windows container. If not, it would be Amazon ECS hosting managed Windows container. Now for .NET Core and .NET 5, if you're still targeting Windows, it would be the same questions there. You would end up with either an ECS or EKS Windows container. Now you have other options if you say, I've got a .NET Core, .NET 5 application on Linux. My next question would be, would you like to target serverless functions? If so, I would suggest AWS Lambda. If not, the next question is, would you like serverless container management? If not, it's really, you'll see the green extended over here, it's really back to that replatform discussion and the Kubernetes discussion. The only difference here is that you would have Linux containers for EKS or ECS. If it is a serverless container, then the next question again is Kubernetes. If it is with Kubernetes, then it would be AWS Fargate, our serverless container compute option, with EKS, managed Linux container. Or if you're not a Kubernetes shop, then it would be AWS Fargate with ECS, managed Linux container. Now the next slide, I know internally in the team, when I put this in the deck recently, they were asking, why are you talking about processors in a conversation about application frameworks? And there's really an important reason for this. If you've been following .NET 5 and the blog posts about the performance increases, one of the great stories they have is the performance increases around ARM64. And when I read it, I'm like, wow, that's great. We've actually made a great deal of investment in our custom chip, which is AWS Graviton 2. And one of the things that I came to the conclusion was that AWS is the only major cloud provider that provides an ARM64 architecture option using Graviton 2, helping customers running .NET 5 realize ARM64 performance improvements with all .NET 5 Linux supported distributions. Now, in general, and .NET 5 has just come out, so we don't have the specifics with .NET 5, but in general, we've found that customers can see up to a 40% price performance over the comparable current generation of x86-based instances. Some of these slides you'll notice at the bottom here, I have a URL, so if you want to find out more about Graviton, you can click on that. And if you are exploring from the console, you can spin up an EC2 instance, and what you want to look for is those EC2 instance, and you want to check the 64-bit ARM selection there. It will default to the x86, so you just check that off, and then you can spin up an instance and see how it performs. The other exciting thing I found when I was looking at performance increases was around gRPC. And when you think about creating a well-architected gRPC solution, one of the things you'll have to do for resiliency is to actually have load balancers in the mix. And specifically, you need those load balancers to be smart enough that if an instance isn't doing well, then it will terminate that instance, spin up other instances, basically shift that load. And that's accomplished with health checks. And right now, we're the only major cloud provider that actually provides those gRPC health checks and full status code reporting for gRPC. The value there, again, is, and I've created a simple diagram here to just explain that. So if you're creating a well-architected application here, you would be able to integrate that for your clients. And when you're spinning up that application load balancer, what you'll see now, which just came out a couple weeks ago, is these two new options with HTTP2 and gRPC. So you'd want to check that gRPC option. It's a long URL, that blog post, so I've reduced it down to this simple URL. So you'd want to use that simple URL to connect to it. All right, Now let's take a quick look at some of our development tools. And when we look at .NET developers, we focus on what's important to those .NET developers. One, we want a rich IDE and editor support. We want it fully featured and easily consumable SDK. Want it to be an easy debugging and testing experience. Want to have command line support, CI/CD integration, and support for cross-platform development with .NET Core and .NET 5. So here are some of our offerings. On the first column here, we have the IDE integration options. We have our AWS Toolkit for Visual Studio, our Toolkit for Visual Studio Code, and our Toolkit for Rider. I'll show some examples of those in just a minute. From a programmable SDK, we have our AWS SDK for .NET, and we have our AWS CDK for .NET. Again, showing slides on those in just a minute. Command line tool options, we're going to have AWS Tools for PowerShell, .NET CLI extensions, AWS CLI, and AWS SAM, which is our serverless application model. CI/CD integration, we have AWS Tools for Azure DevOps, and we have our AWS Code Pipeline, Code Build, and I don't have listed here, Code Commit and Code Deploy utilities. And finally, we have our migration and modernization tools, App2Container, and Porting Assistant for .NET. First, let's take a look at AWS Toolkit for Visual Studio, and I will be demoing this at the end, but we're just going to take a quick overview here of what we can do with it. So within this toolkit, again, it's been around, I believe, about 10 years now, and it's got a rich feature set. It's got a central AWS Explorer tool to look at S3 buckets, DynamoDB, EC2 compute instances, and a number of other AWS services. We have wizards for deploying to Elastic Beanstalk, to Elastic Container Service, to Lambda, and for CloudFormation. You'll see in the demo there we have a getting started blueprints to help expedite your building those applications. And then we have a code editing IntelliSense for CloudFormation when you're building the JSON templates. And again, you'll see a URL at the bottom if you want more information about any of these products. And for the toolkit, you can deploy 3 options. You can deploy to Elastic Beanstalk, you can publish your container to AWS, and you can upload your Lambda function. Now, these are right-click options, and what I try to emphasize when I talk to customers that these are great for evaluation and development, but I wouldn't recommend them for production. We have many CI/CD options to have formal production deploys. Most organizations don't want to have their developers right-clicking and deploying applications. And developers, frankly, don't want to be on the hook normally to right-click and deploy applications. So keep that in mind. Great evaluation tool, but the next step if you are going to production is taking a look at some of our CI/CD options. We also have the AWS Toolkit for Visual Studio Code. This allows you to target serverless applications within our extension for Visual Studio Code. Again, below we have our links there, and we also have on GitHub the source if you want to make contributions. Our other toolkit option for IDEs is our AWS Toolkit for Rider. If you're not familiar with Rider, it's a product by JetBrains, the company that's behind ReSharper. And basically what they did is they created a new IDE with all that ReSharper functionality in it to build .NET applications. The toolkit for Rider, like VS Code, is targeted to the serverless experience. But the team is looking for feedback to see what other features you are looking for. And again, if you see that GitHub link, you can go there and submit suggestions. Next, let's look at our AWS SDK for .NET. This is a central home for all the SDK and extension libraries. It is, again, the source is available on GitHub. It provides a programmatic access to all AWS services and has various extension libraries for higher level functionality. Cross-platform support for .NET, including .NET Framework, .NET Core, .NET 5, and Xamarin deployments. And it is open source. And it follows the NuGet model of taking those libraries and having them distributed on NuGet. And as you can tell, it's at the center of our offering here. So the tools I was mentioning earlier, such as AWS Tools for PowerShell and our Toolkit for Visual Studio, are actually based off of the AWS SDK. You can use it for other purposes too, for a session provider, a trace listener. What I was mentioning earlier too, what we're calling between low-level service APIs and higher-level utility APIs. The SDK will provide consistent access to all of those low-level APIs. And then for those that are more popular with .NET development, we'll have specific libraries that we call the higher-level utility APIs. And notice down below here, we support .NET Framework 3.5, .NET Framework 4.5, .NET Core, .NET 5, and Xamarin. And we support those through .NET Standard 2.0. You'll notice this little asterisk I just put in next to Xamarin. The reason for that is with Xamarin, you do need to target .NET Standard 2.0 in your Xamarin app to be able to use the AWS SDK for .NET. What I was mentioning earlier is that we have a consistent coding pattern with this. So you don't need to know the specifics of a particular API. Instead, you'll know its service name, and then you'll put another using statement in, service name.model, and there'll be Amazon service name client. And then if it's async, which would be for .NET Core and .NET 5 apps, you'd have that async. So pretty quickly, once you're using the SDK, you'll say, okay, it doesn't matter if I'm doing connecting to S3 or DynamoDB, it's going to be that same consistent experience. So it makes programming much more efficient. And a real world example here. We take a look, we have iterating through an S3 instance. So we're going to take a look and go through a bucket that we have in our US West 2 region. And we'll iterate through those buckets there, and then this basically writes out the key and the last modified date. And for command line tools, a really popular tool set we have is our AWS Tools for PowerShell. Again, supports PowerShell and PowerShell.NET Core. And the key thing that we like to emphasize is if it's something you can do in the SDK, you can script it in PowerShell. Again, PowerShell tool built off of the SDK. We also follow the .NET CLI model, so we have CLI extensions there. So you would follow that simple .NET tool install /g with a tool name that you want to install. Here's an example with Lambda. So running .NET new -i in parentheses here, Amazon lambda.templates, : asterisk. And what we have here is the ability to list out, after we've installed that, all of the various Lambda options. And we have our .NET tool install -g amazon.lambda.tools. And if we take a look here, when we run a .NET Lambda help, it defines all of the various functions that you have related to that. And same thing here for ECS. And Elastic Beanstalk. I mentioned our CI/CD integrations. If you're on Azure DevOps, we actually have a toolkit for you. So with this, you can actually do the last bit or the last mile deploy to AWS. So you can continue to work within Azure DevOps, and then when you're ready to deploy to AWS, we have that toolkit option available for you. And again, like others, if you want more information, it's the link down below. Looking at our CI/CD options here, what I like to emphasize with customers is that it's not an all or nothing proposition here with our CI/CD services. For example, you can use Code Pipeline to orchestrate, but you don't have to use our services. Now, we'd love it if you did, but if you happen to use GitHub for your source control, you don't need to switch to AWS Code Commit. You can actually call that GitHub repo from Code Pipeline. Now, if you are starting new and you want to actually try out our services, absolutely. You can create in our Git compatible service, AWS Code Commit. You can try that. Same thing with Code Build. It's our build service. If you happen to be using Jenkins or another product to build like TeamCity, you can incorporate that in your code pipeline. Now with Code Deploy, you're likely going to be calling Code Deploy because that actually manages the deployment to our infrastructure. And I just map out here some of the different options here. When you deploy, you can deploy to EC2, Lambda, or through one of our container services there. AWS Cloud Development Kit allows you to use C# to define infrastructure as code. So no longer do you have to actually spend all your time in CloudFormation, whether you're using JSON or YAML. And if you happen to love coding all that out in JSON or YAML, you can still continue to do that. What CDK does for you is it allows you to take that C# experience that you have and use that. And here's an example of using the CDK to create an Amazon SQS call. And what we have is we build our new queue, define our topic here. And again, we're doing this via C#. All right, let's turn our attention to our migration and modernization tools. Again, just introduced this summer is our App2Container tool. This allows us to containerize and migrate existing applications. So if you have a legacy application and you don't have the budget or the time to upgrade that, let's say you have a .NET 4.5 application and you want to upgrade that, or you wanted to have that hosted on AWS, what this tool does is it would put it into a container and then you can deploy it to AWS. Porting Assistant is a utility that allows you to take an older application that's in .NET Framework and provides you a utility that lists out how you can upgrade to .NET Core. It doesn't do all of the work for you, but it will create the solution, project, and references that you need. So it will get you much farther along than if you were just trying to do it by yourself. So very helpful utility to say, okay, here are the NuGet packages that are equivalent in .NET Core versus .NET Framework. I mentioned earlier we have partners. Here are three I'd like to highlight. With AWS Partner Network, we have three partners here that are related to your .NET experience. We have GitLab, JetBrains, and Atlassian. They provide a variety of services including CI/CD tools, IDE experiences, and productivity software. And turning our attention to .NET 5 on AWS, we have a number of services and tools available today that are .NET 5 compatible. And then we have the 6 options that I show that are coming soon. So we have, as I mentioned earlier, our Elastic Beanstalk, our image builder, our toolkit updates that will support the Beanstalk updates, our X-ray service, secrets manager, and AWS code build. All right, let's take a look at some demos. All right, so what we're going to do is open up Visual Studio. And on this machine, I have the AWS Toolkit for Visual Studio installed, which also installs the SDK and some other options. And we're going to create the new project here. And I am going to go and create a ASP.NET Core web app. We'll hit next there. And what I want to show you first is how we traditionally do it with Elastic Beanstalk. And I'll use 3.1 as the example. And the reason why I'm doing that is that right now, .NET 5, their Elastic Beanstalk team is still working on the managed images to support that. So in the near future, you're going to follow the same process as you would for 3.1 that you would if you're going to target 5.0. So that's why I'm going to show you 3.1, and then I'll show you the workaround we have to get 5.0 up and running. Again, it's for a short period of time until they have those images up. So we'll create this, and actually, why don't we call this demo. And ASP.NET Core Web App, and again, I'm going to target 3.1 here. I'm going to uncheck HTTPS to keep that simple, and create. All right, as that's loading up there, you'll see we have our AWS Explorer. And I'm going to actually choose a different region than US East. I am going to go, how about we go up to Canada for the deployment. And since I'm going to have a number of these here, why don't we go in and update the opening page so we know which one we're on. So I'm going to go and update that to, say this is a .NET Core 3.1 application running. We'll run it locally just to make sure everything's working, although it's not overly complicated. And in fact, it is working. We'll close that out and let's begin the deploy. Again, right click. Go down to Publish to AWS Elastic Beanstalk. We're going to create it as a new application. You'll see it'll be targeting the same region we had defaulted to in Explorer. And for environment, we'll pick a name here. Now this might not be a unique name, so we'll have to check the availability. It passes, so we'll go to next. I'm going to use an Amazon Linux 2 instance. I'm going to keep it simple by just targeting a single instance for this demo. Hit next. I'm going to go with the default roles. And again, we're targeting .NET Core 3.1. And deploy. While that's running, I'm going to go on to show you what the workaround right now is for 5.0. Again, it is a short time here that we have to do this. And right click here, we'll start and add a new project. Again, this is going to be an ASP.NET Core web app. Let's just call this, have a suffix .NET 5. And again, web app. And this time we'll do 5.0. Take off HTTPS to keep it simple. And to track, we'll update the language here. Say this is a .NET 5 application. And we'll debug it just to make sure everything's running correctly. And it is. All right. Then what we'll do is we'll right click on this and we'll go down to Publish to AWS Elastic Beanstalk. create as a new application. Again, we want to validate that the environment URL name is unique, and it is. Now for this workaround, if you're using this wizard, you do need to target a Amazon Linux 2 instance. And we'll go with the role. And we're going to check off this right here, which is the build self-contained deployment bundle. This is actually a feature of .NET, and it will incorporate the runtime and anything else that's needed as part of the deployment there. And again, this is a short-term fix until the Elastic Beanstalk team updates to include .NET 5 to target. And we'll hit next and deploy. And while that's running, let's check back in on our other environment. And it's still saying launching and environment's healthy. Wow, that was actually perfect timing. So we should now be able to click on that URL from that 3.1 environment that we just deployed. And in fact, there it is, 3.1. And I'm going to close out of that. And .NET 5 instance is now deploying. And that's going to take a little bit longer than the 3.1, again, because we're moving up more than just the code. So while we're waiting for that, why don't we add another project? We'll add new project. And this time we're going to go to filter on platforms here to AWS. And we're going to select an AWS Lambda project. And there it is right there. And again, I'll show it to you using 3.1. I'm just going to go with an empty project. And by the way, that's a blueprint for the project. Okay. And that's still launching. That's the Beanstalk update there. So why don't we go into 3.1 here. I'm going to go into the function here. And right now, that empty blueprint there that I had selected essentially takes whatever is passed to it and returns it in uppercase. So we'll add a little something to that instead of that. That'll also tell us what we're running. So this will now say we're running a .NET 3.1 and essentially say we're yelling back at you by turning anything you say into uppercase. And we'll deploy that. We'll right-click on that. And we're going to say publish to AWS Lambda. You'll notice that the Beanstalk option went away and Lambda option's there. And we are going to target 3.1. We do need to give it a name. So why don't we go with yelling back with .NET. Go with the other options, default options. And for role, not doing anything elaborate there. So let's scroll down and we'll choose the Lambda basic execution role. And the other options we're going to leave the same. Not doing any heavy lifting here. We'll hit upload. And when that's complete, we have a test harness here that we can try it out with. And within here, let's say, let's see, how are you doing? We'll send that to our new serverless function. And get back our response. Hello, .NET Core 3.1 application from Lambda yelling back at you. How are you doing? All right. And just going to check in on the Beanstalk option. Yep, and it's ready. So this is with .NET 5. And there it is. So this is on an EC2 instance that was deployed with Elastic Beanstalk, our .NET 5 application. And then finally, we'll do a deployment to Lambda for .NET 5. So I'm going to right click and say add new project. And again, we're going to choose a AWS Lambda project. And let's update the name to .NET 5. Now, I glossed over this just a minute ago, but again, this is a screen of the various blueprint options that you have available for Lambda. I had chosen empty function before, but we do have a number of samples that will create that functionality for you so that you know, for instance, if you knew you were going to use S3, it would put in an example of how to call an S3 function. Now, in this case, to use .NET 5, you need to use a custom runtime function. The reason for that is Lambda only supports LTS or long-term support releases. .NET 5 is not a long-term support release. .NET Core 3.1 is. So that's why you won't see it. If I chose empty, you wouldn't see it as an option. But instead, if we use the custom runtime function, that will allow us to target .NET 5. So we use that, hit finish. And again, just so we know what we're working with here, I'm going to go into function.cs. And I'm going to update what is returned. And put in there something that we can see that tells us that this is the .NET 5 application. We'll hit save there. And again, it's a right-click, publish to AWS Lambda option. You will notice it's a little bit different here. The runtime language here will show custom.NET Core runtime. And then function name. Let's go with yelling back with .NET 5.0 on Lambda demo. Yes, I'm not good with short function names. And we'll hit, and you will notice the framework says .NET 5.0 there. Next. And role, again, we're not doing anything elaborate here, so we'll go with a fairly basic permissions. And we'll hit upload. All right. Now you'll notice that upload does take longer. We did fast forward through it, so you didn't have to sit around waiting for it to complete. And again, the reason for that is that we're uploading the runtime in addition to the code here. But let's give it a shot and say, how are you doing? And this is going to send that request to our new serverless function. We'll invoke that. And we get our response back. Hello, .NET 5 application from AWS Lambda, yelling back at you. You said, how are you doing? So we have successfully got our .NET 5 application up and running on Lambda. All right. So again, options with Lambda, you can continue to target 3.1, which is the long-term release. You would use the standard function there. You can use any of those blueprints that you saw. But if you are going to target .NET 5, you want to use a custom runtime blueprint. With Elastic Beanstalk, you can continue to target 3.1. If you want to target 5 before the 5.0 runtimes are available, you'll need to use the workaround I showed you. After that's released, it's going to be the same experience as 3.1. You'll just have to target 5 instead of 3.1. All right, that does it for the demo there. And we have some of the other services listed here that you might be interested in as a .NET developer, from NoSQL solutions to how to monitor your application. You might be asking, well, where do I start? I've got a link here that you can go to that brings you to our .NET Build Modern page that lists a number of options for building .NET applications on AWS. I encourage you to go there and start. I hope I met my goal here to show you that AWS loves .NET. If you have questions, please use the chat and we can follow up. If you have suggestions on how we can improve, we definitely want to provide the service teams that produce these services feedback on how they can improve our .NET offerings. Here's some useful links. A .NET homepage, more information about our open source .NET tools, deploying and developing .NET applications, a white paper. This is a great white paper that goes through even more options than what I talked about. We have our training and certification course for getting started with .NET on AWS. It's a fundamentals level course. And then our friend Julie Lerman has recently produced a Pluralsight course, which is also a fundamentals course on building .NET applications. And this brings us to Q&A. Again, if you have questions, please ask them in the chat and we can provide answers, hopefully, or at least let you know how what resources are available to answer those questions. Again, thank you for tuning in for our chat today and look forward to speaking to you again.